Chapter 1. Exile Among the Stars. The cold void beyond the battered porthole of the transport ship stretched endlessly, an abyss where stars flickered like distant memories, indifferent and distant, and yet infinitely beautiful in their cruel detachment. Kayla sat silently in her cramped cell, the thin hum of the ship's engines a constant reminder that she was being taken farther and farther away from everything she had ever known: her homeworld, her family, her life before the sentence was pronounced. The official verdict was merciless and absolute: treason against the Galactic Commonwealth, disruption of social order, incitement of rebellion. The councils and courts had condemned her to exile on Nyx 9, a desolate asteroid prison nestled on the fringes of explored space, a place so remote and inhospitable that no one alive had ever returned from it. For them, it was a death sentence, a banishment beyond the reach of mercy or memory. But for Kayla, shackled in cold restraints yet burning with a fierce light inside, it was not the end but the beginning of a new chapter, a chance to forge strength in solitude and rise like a phoenix from the ashes of disgrace. Nyx 9 was unlike any place Kayla had ever seen. As the ship's engines sputtered and died, leaving only the dim glow of distant suns to illuminate the rugged landscape, she gazed out onto the asteroid's barren surface, a jagged wasteland of razor-sharp rocks and dust storms that blotted out the weak sunlight for days at a time. The atmosphere was thin, toxic, and volatile, forcing all who lived there to wear protective suits even under the weak, flickering glow of the artificial domes scattered across the mining colony. These domes, relics of forgotten ambition, housed a few thousand souls who eked out a meager existence, trapped by their own mistakes, political purges, or the cruelty of circumstance. As Kayla stepped onto the cold surface for the first time, the weight of her sentence pressed heavily on her shoulders, but her eyes were sharp, scanning, calculating. She was not broken. Exile had forged a new edge in her spirit, a hunger to survive that burned hotter than the radioactive dust swirling around her boots. Her arrival was met with cold stares and whispered rumors. The colony's leaders, a council of hardened miners and retired military officers, regarded her as a threat, a wild card whose fiery rhetoric had once galvanized entire worlds and whose presence could ignite unrest even here, among the forgotten. But Kayla understood their fear, for she had felt the same fire in herself, a restless defiance that refused to be silenced by chains or condemnation. The first days on Nyx 9 were a brutal baptism by ice and dust, the environment punishing any sign of weakness. The mining tunnels beneath the colony were claustrophobic and treacherous, lined with ancient machinery barely clinging to life, and veins of or so deep they seemed to disappear into the planet's very core. Kayla was assigned to the grueling labor squads, forced to work alongside men and women who had lost everything but their grudges and scars. Yet, even in this pitiless place, she saw sparks of potential raw talent, buried ideals, the same hunger to rise that she carried inside her own chest. Night fell quickly on Nyx 9, and with it came a silence so profound it echoed in the bones, broken only by the howl of the wind against the colony's metal walls. In these long, dark hours, Kayla allowed herself to dream again, not of escape, for she knew the cold void was vast and unyielding, but of revolution. Exile had stripped away the trappings of power and privilege, but it had also granted clarity. Here, in the crucible of isolation, she could build something new, an alliance forged not by politics or titles, but by shared survival and unbroken will. She began speaking quietly with fellow prisoners, those willing to listen, weaving a network of whispered hopes and careful plans beneath the colony's watchful eyes. It was dangerous, subversive work, but Kayla knew that even the smallest flame could ignite a wildfire if fed with enough passion and purpose. The harsh conditions of Nyx 9 tested every facet of their resolve. Food was scarce and rationed, water recycled and purified through ancient systems that creaked and groaned under constant strain. The colony's artificial gravity fluctuated, leaving moments of disorientation and vertigo that frayed nerves and sharpened tempers. Disease lurked in the stagnant air, and violence simmered beneath the surface as desperation drove some to break the fragile peace. Yet Kayla found strength not only in endurance, but in leadership. Her presence galvanized the disillusioned and the hopeless, her words fanning the embers of courage in hearts long dimmed. She organized secret training sessions, teaching self-defense techniques scavenged from old manuals, and shared knowledge of political strategy and hope, stitching together a fragile tapestry of rebellion. One night, beneath the flickering lights of the mining dome, Kayla stood before a gathering of allies miners, ex-soldiers, engineers all bound by the same chains of exile and the same burning desire to reclaim their futures. Her voice was steady and clear as she spoke of change, of fighting not just for survival, but for justice and dignity. The words reverberated through the cold chamber, igniting something deeper than fear or anger, an unyielding resolve that promised that though they were cast into darkness, they would carve out a dawn. Outside, the winds howled against the domes, carrying their silent vow into the endless void, a declaration that exile was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a revolution that could shake the stars themselves. The barren landscape of Nyx 9 stretched endlessly under a bruised sky, a wasteland carved from the remnants of shattered moons and drifting cosmic debris, a place where hope seemed to wither beneath the weight of isolation and despair. Kayla's first steps on the asteroid's surface were heavy with the gravity of her sentence, yet beneath the stoic exterior beat a heart unbroken by judgment or exile. Her suit hissed softly as the life support systems calibrated against the planet's toxic atmosphere, shielding her fragile humanity from the biting cold and chemical storms that swept across the rocky plains with relentless fury. Around her, the mining colony sprawled like a scar on the asteroid's pockmarked face. Metal domes battered by centuries of harsh weather, tunnels burrowing deep beneath the surface like veins of forgotten ambition, and faint glimmers of life struggling stubbornly against the dark. The inhabitants were ghosts of their former selves, scarred by punishment and stripped of futures, yet beneath their weary gazes flickered sparks of resilience that drew Kayla's attention and stirred her resolve. Inside the dimly lit dormitories, she was assigned to a small, cramped cell, barely large enough to contain the basic equipment stripped from her before exile. The walls were cold, forged from the same gray stone that composed the asteroid's crust, and the air was stale with the scent of recycled oxygen and worn machinery. She lay on the thin cot, staring up at the cracked ceiling as memories surged, the trial, the betrayal, the faces of those who had condemned her. But her mind was not consumed by regret. Rather, it churned with fierce determination, a quiet vow that exile would not mark her end, but rather a new beginning. Outside, the colony's systems buzzed with mechanical monotony, yet beneath the surface, Kayla sensed the restless pulse of a community on the edge, fractured, fearful, but not yet broken. And in that knowledge, she found her purpose, to awaken that pulse into a roar, to transform a sentence of death into the spark of revolution. The first weeks were brutal. The work in the mining shafts was grueling and dangerous. Long hours spent navigating narrow tunnels slick with dust and the ever-present threat of collapse. Kayla's body ached from exertion, her hands raw from handling heavy equipment, yet her spirit remained unbowed. She observed her fellow exiles keenly, warriors reduced to laborers, scholars stripped of voice, and idealists forced into silence. Many had resigned themselves to their fate, but a few carried hidden flames of defiance, flickering beneath the surface of their hardened exteriors. Slowly, Kayla began to reach out, forging fragile connections through whispered conversations and shared hardships. She listened more than she spoke, learning the histories and grievances that bound these outcasts together. Her words were measured, chosen carefully to inspire trust and kindle hope without drawing the watchful eyes of the colony's enforcers. She spoke of survival, of reclaiming dignity in the face of oppression, of the power that lay in unity. And in the quiet corners of the colony, where light barely penetrated, those words began to take root. Nights on Nyx 9 were unforgiving. The asteroid's rotation was slow and erratic, casting long, freezing shadows that swallowed the colony in darkness. The air was thin, the cold so severe it seemed to seep into the bones despite the suits and artificial heaters. The silence was punctuated only by distant rumbles of shifting stone and the occasional clatter of loose debris. It was in these long hours of solitude that Kayla found clarity, honing her mind as sharply as her body. She studied the colony's systems, mapped the tunnels, and learned the routines of the guards. She discovered hidden alcoves and unused shafts, places where secret meetings might take place, where whispered plans could be hatched away from prying censors. Each day, she grew more confident, her vision of a new beginning crystallizing like the frost patterns that decorated the colony's windows. Her exile was a crucible, burning away illusions and forging a leader from the ashes of her former self. The colony's leadership viewed her with suspicion and hostility, a wild card whose presence threatened to unravel their fragile order. Rumors spread quickly, whispers of unrest and conspiracy, fed by the paranoia of those who clung desperately to power. But Kayla remained patient, biding her time as she gathered allies from unexpected quarters. A miner whose family had been destroyed by political purges, a former intelligence officer stripped of rank for questioning orders, and a young engineer whose inventions had been confiscated for fear they would empower dissent. Together, they formed the nucleus of a movement that transcended species, rank, and past enmities. Their meetings were secret and tense, conducted in the shadows of abandoned corridors and beneath the flickering lights of malfunctioning terminals. They shared stories, hopes, and fears, weaving a tapestry of rebellion that promised not just survival, but transformation. And so, beneath the unforgiving skies of Nix 9, where the universe had sought to erase her, Kayla's exile became the seedbed of revolution. They called it a death sentence, a final punishment for a woman who dared to defy the established order. But she called it the beginning, the start of a struggle that would shake the foundations of power, ignite the spirits of the forgotten, and reach beyond the cold silence of a forsaken asteroid to the farthest stars. As the colony slept fitfully beneath the cold glow of distant suns, Kayla's resolve burned brighter than ever, a flame that no darkness could extinguish. Chapter 2. Embers in the Abyss. The harsh wind screamed like a banshee across the jagged crags of Nix 9's barren surface, ripping at the flimsy metallic domes and rattling the exposed pipes that fed the mining colony's skeletal infrastructure. Inside the deepest tunnels, where sunlight was nothing more than a legend whispered by those who still clung to the hope of returning home, Kayla felt the weight of exile settle heavier with each passing day. The cold was an enemy that gnawed relentlessly not just at the flesh, but at the spirit, a silent predator that tested the limits of endurance. Yet beneath the crushing isolation, something remarkable began to stir. What had been whispered as a death sentence was slowly transforming into a crucible of fire and purpose, and Kayla's mind, sharp and relentless, was forging a new kind of rebellion, one born not out of rage, but calculated resilience, and the careful weaving of alliances among the broken. The colony's prisoners were a fractured mosaic of despair and defiance, their fractured pasts a web of secrets, pain, and grudges. Yet Kayla's vision for unity kindled a fragile light in the abyss. Every morning in the tunnels was a battle against exhaustion and despair. The miners' lungs burned from inhaling recycled air heavy with dust, the harsh clang of pickaxes against, or a grim soundtrack to their days. Kayla, despite being new to the physical toll of such labor, bore her share of the burden with quiet determination. She moved among her fellow exiles, her presence a steadying force, her eyes keenly observing the flickers of resistance beneath stoic faces. She began to notice subtle signs, furtive glances exchanged between hardened miners, whispered conversations cut short at the approach of guards, small acts of sabotage against the colony's failing machinery. These were sparks, tiny embers smoldering beneath the surface of fear and oppression. Kayla's task was to nurture these embers, to transform them into a blaze capable of challenging the colony's harsh order and, perhaps, sending ripples far beyond the asteroid's frozen crust. To do so, she understood that brute force would only lead to swift destruction. Instead, she wielded patience and cunning, adopting the role of a quiet catalyst. In secret, she held clandestine meetings in the forgotten tunnels, where the colony's surveillance was weakest and the walls themselves seemed to swallow sound. There, in the dim light of flickering holoscreens patched together from salvaged parts, Kayla shared not just words of rebellion, but technical manuals from Earth, strategies gleaned from ancient political treatises, stories of revolutions that had toppled empires despite overwhelming odds. She spoke of hope as a weapon sharper than any blade, a force capable of uniting disparate factions into a coherent movement. Her listeners, initially wary and broken, began to awaken, their eyes brightening with the possibility that exile was not an end but a battleground for change. Yet the colony was a cauldron of tension, where old wounds festered and distrust ran deep. The guards, loyal to the distant Commonwealth but hardened by years of isolation, watched Kayla with growing suspicion. Whispers of sedition and conspiracy stirred unrest, prompting tighter controls and harsher punishments. Several of Kayla's early allies vanished under mysterious circumstances, their fates a chilling reminder of the stakes involved. But rather than deter her, these losses steeled her resolve. She became a master of subterfuge, cloaking her plans in layers of secrecy and deception, recruiting only those whose loyalty was forged in shared suffering. Every whispered meeting, every covert act of defiance was a calculated risk, a move in a dangerous game where the price of failure was death or worse, oblivion in the cold expanse. Amid these struggles, Kayla's thoughts often drifted to the wider galaxy, the systems that had turned their backs on Nyx. 9. The towering political edifices that dismissed her and her fellow exiles as insignificant pawns. But she knew that revolutions began in shadows, in the forgotten corners where desperation bred innovation. Her mind raced with possibilities. If she could unite the disparate factions of the colony, build a network strong enough to challenge the authority of the governors, perhaps Nyx, 9 could become more than a graveyard. It could become a beacon, a thorn in the side of a complacent commonwealth, and a rallying point for all those cast aside by the tides of history. She envisioned a new future, one where exile was transformed from a sentence into a summons to fight, to rise, and to reclaim dignity and power. The nights on Nyx, 9 were especially cruel, the darkness pressing in with a suffocating weight that made even the faintest whisper sound like a shout. Kayla often found herself standing beneath the fragile dome of the miner's habitat, staring out into the star-speckled void. The stars, distant and cold, reminded her of the vastness of the universe and the smallness of their place within it. Yet, paradoxically, they also symbolized connection, a network of lights bridging the emptiness, much like the network she was building among her people. It was during these solitary moments that Kayla felt the true burden of exile, but also the seed of hope that kept her going. She was not alone in the abyss. The embers she had kindled burned quietly but persistently, ready to burst into flame. As weeks blurred into months, Kayla's movement grew. Small acts of rebellion became bolder machinery sabotaged to disrupt the colony's oppressive schedule, communications intercepted and rerouted to spread messages of solidarity, guards bribed or convinced to turn a blind eye. The colony's fragile order trembled beneath the pressure of growing unrest. Kayla's leadership transformed her from a marked exile into a symbol of resistance, a living testament that even in the bleakest conditions, the human spirit and the spirits of those who stood with her could not be extinguished. The beginning she had spoken of was unfolding, a slow but unstoppable thaw in the frozen heart of exile, promising that the sentence handed down was but a prologue to a story of defiance, unity, and transformation. Chapter 3. Flames of Rebellion. The days on Nyx, 9 bled into one another in a relentless gray haze where time lost meaning and hope seemed a fragile, fleeting whisper beneath the weight of dust and despair. Yet amidst this oppressive monotony, Kayla's vision began to take tangible shape, a subtle but inexorable shift in the currents of power and allegiance. The rebellion she had nurtured, once little more than scattered sparks of discontent, now blazed into a conflagration that threatened to consume the fragile order of the colony. It was a slow burn, a careful kindling of flames that required patience, strategy, and unyielding courage. Kayla moved among the miners, the ex-soldiers, and the forgotten engineers with a steady gaze that both comforted and commanded. She had become more than a leader. She was a symbol, the living embodiment of resistance against a system that had tried to erase her. The network she wove stretched beyond whispered meetings and shadowed tunnels. It now reached into every corner of Nix-9's battered infrastructure, a web of loyalty and defiance ready to be activated. The colony itself was a microcosm of fractured alliances and simmering grudges, a tinderbox where old rivalries threatened to ignite at any moment. Kayla knew that the rebellion's success hinged not merely on shared suffering, but on forging unity from diversity, a task as complex as navigating the labyrinthine mines that tunneled deep beneath the asteroid's surface. The miners came from a dozen different worlds, each bearing scars not only from physical exile, but from cultural clashes and long-held prejudices. The ex-soldiers carried the weight of battles lost and comrades fallen, their loyalty hard-won and fiercely guarded. Engineers and technicians, whose skills kept the colony barely functional, eyed the rebellion with cautious curiosity and veiled suspicion. Kayla's challenge was to bind these disparate threads into a cohesive force, to transform fractured despair into collective purpose. Her charisma was tempered by humility and a deep understanding that leadership was not a mantle, but a shared burden. Under Kayla's guidance, the rebellion shifted from secret meetings to coordinated actions. The sabotage of machinery, once isolated and sporadic, became a calculated strategy to undermine the colony's oppressive routines and strain the resources of the governing council. Communications were hacked and rerouted, spreading coded messages of hope and instruction that transcended language and species barriers. Kayla's own history of political activism proved invaluable as she devised plans that balanced risk with potential gain, ensuring that each strike advanced their cause without provoking overwhelming retaliation. The Guards, once a monolithic force of suppression, began to fracture under the pressure of divided loyalties and whispered bribes. Kayla had reached some among them disillusioned veterans who remembered better days and dreamed of a future reclaimed. Their support was clandestine but crucial, a wedge driving through the colony's oppressive hierarchy. Yet rebellion on Nix-9 was not without cost. The harsh environment and constant threat of discovery weighed heavily on the rebels. Punishments for dissent were brutal and public, designed to instill fear and crush morale. Several of Kayla's closest allies were seized in surprise raids, their fates unknown but assumed grim. Each loss was a bitter blow, yet it also steeled Kayla's resolve and deepened the bonds among those who remained. They shared stories of sacrifice and survival, their whispered vows weaving a tapestry of resilience that no prison walls could contain. Kayla herself bore scars, both visible and invisible, moments of doubt fought off with sheer will, and injuries sustained in scrapes and escapes that tested the limits of her endurance. Through it all, the furnace of rebellion burned brighter, fed by the collective courage of a community rising from the ashes of exile. In the cold nights beneath the asteroid's fractured sky, Kayla often found herself alone on the colony's highest ridge, staring out at the faint glow of distant stars and the blackness beyond. The vastness of space, so beautiful and indifferent, reminded her of the fragility of their existence and the enormity of the struggle ahead. Yet in that solitude, she also found clarity and strength. The rebellion was more than a fight for survival. It was a fight for identity, for dignity, for the right to reclaim a future stolen by judgment and exile. She dreamed of a day when Nix-9 would no longer be a forgotten tomb, but a beacon of hope and renewal, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to be silenced. Each spark of defiance, each act of courage, brought them closer to that vision. The flame they had kindled in the abyss was spreading, and soon it would consume the darkness. Chapter 4: The Dawn of Reclamation. The cold that had once gnawed mercilessly at the bones of the exiled now seemed less a curse and more a distant memory, fading beneath the rising heat of something far more formidable, the unyielding fire of rebellion and renewal. The once-forgotten asteroid prison of Nix-9, scarred by years of despair and desolation, was transforming beneath the determined hands of Kayla and her burgeoning movement. What had begun as whispered promises and shadowed tunnels had ignited into a full blaze of uprising, a defiance that resonated through the metal veins and rocky arteries of the colony. The air, once thick with the stench of resignation, now hummed with the electric pulse of revolution, a current of hope and unbreakable will that surged through the veins of miners, ex-soldiers, and engineers alike. Kayla stood at the heart of this transformation, her gaze sharp and steady, her mind a nexus of strategy and vision. She was no longer merely a prisoner marked for oblivion. She was a beacon of change, a leader whose fire had rekindled the spirit of a community long thought lost to the cold embrace of exile. Days of meticulous planning had culminated in a moment poised between chaos and order, a crescendo in the symphony of rebellion that demanded courage, sacrifice, and unyielding resolve. The colony's communication arrays, once muted and controlled by distant governors, now crackled with intercepted signals and coded transmissions, weaving a tapestry of coordination that spanned every sector of Nix-9. Sabotage had become systematic, targeting the very infrastructure that held the colony in its iron grip. Power grids flickered and died, machinery ground to a halt in the mines, supply lines were disrupted with precision strikes. The guards, caught in the shifting tides of loyalty and fear, found themselves increasingly isolated, their commands drowned beneath the rising chorus of defiance. In hidden chambers and abandoned tunnels, Kayla and her closest lieutenants orchestrated movements with a deft hand, their whispered orders carrying the weight of hope and revolution. Every action was a calculated risk, every success a step closer to reclaiming not just a physical space but the dignity stolen from them all. The social fabric of the colony had woven itself anew. Former enemies now stood shoulder to shoulder, their differences eclipsed by a shared destiny forged in hardship and hope. The miners' grit complemented the ex-soldiers' discipline. The engineer's ingenuity balanced the strategist's vision. Kayla's leadership transcended species and rank, uniting a fractured mosaic into a coherent force. Beneath the domes, where the cold winds no longer dared to howl unchecked, the people began to reclaim their lives, organizing, rebuilding, dreaming. They created schools and forums for discussion, fostering a culture of collaboration and empowerment that the distant governors had long tried to suppress. Kayla's presence was both symbol and catalyst, a living testament that exile was not the extinguishing of a flame but the kindling of a new dawn. She moved among her people with quiet strength, listening, advising, inspiring, always mindful that the true power of their movement lay not in the force of arms, but in the unbreakable spirit of unity. Yet the path to freedom was neither straight nor certain. The Commonwealth, distant but watchful, was a looming specter ready to snuff out any flicker of rebellion before it could spread beyond the asteroid's frozen surface. Intelligence reports spoke of fleets mustering in nearby systems, political councils debating responses, and propaganda machines preparing to vilify the exiles as dangerous insurgents. Kayla understood the stakes were now cosmic in scale. Their fight was no longer just for survival within Nix-9's battered walls, but for recognition, autonomy, and justice in a galaxy that had long forgotten them. The movement she led was a beacon not only for the exiled but for all those oppressed across star systems, a symbol of resistance against tyranny and abandonment. The coming confrontation would test every lesson learned in darkness and every ounce of courage forged in exile. As preparations for the inevitable clash intensified, Kayla found herself in moments of solitude on the colony's highest ridge, gazing up at the distant stars that had once seemed cold and unreachable. Now, they shimmered with possibility, a constellation of dreams and defiance lighting the vast void. She thought of the journey from branded traitor to revolutionary leader, the sacrifices made, and the lives transformed by the fire she had ignited. Her heart ached for those lost, yet it swelled with pride for those who remained, warriors of hope and architects of a new destiny. The dawn was breaking on Nix-9, a dawn born not of mercy but of will, and as the first light kissed the jagged horizon, Kayla knew their story was far from over. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter, one where exile would no longer define them, but where they would define exile itself, turning a death sentence into the genesis of a rebellion that would echo across the stars forever. The once silent corridors of Nix-9 now throbbed with the rhythm of rebellion, a symphony of footsteps, whispered plans, and the steady pulse of hearts beating in defiance. Kayla moved through the reclaimed spaces halls once marked by despair, now alive with determination, her presence a beacon guiding her people through the darkest hours before dawn. The rebellion had transformed from scattered acts of resistance into a cohesive force that stood ready to challenge the suffocating grip of the Commonwealth's authority. Every face she passed bore the marks of hardship, but also the unmistakable glow of hope reborn. It was a fragile hope, but one forged in the fires of exile and tempered by the unyielding will to survive and reclaim what was stolen. The turning point came not with the clash of weapons, but with the quiet power of unity and resolve. The colony's communication arrays, once the chains of control, had been repurposed into a network of resistance, broadcasting messages of liberation that reached far beyond the asteroid's frozen surface. Systems neighboring Nyx 9 stirred with curiosity and cautious support as Kayla's words echoed across the void calls for solidarity, justice, and the right to forge one's destiny free from the shadows of exile. Ships once loyal to the Commonwealth hesitated, their crews inspired by the courage of those deemed expendable, the stories of a woman who had turned her death sentence into the dawn of a new era. The political machinery that had sought to silence her now grappled with the reality of a rebellion whose flame could not be extinguished. Yet, the final test loomed as the Commonwealth dispatched a fleet, a cold armada meant to crush the uprising before it could ignite wider flames. The night before the confrontation, Kayla gathered her people in the central dome, their faces illuminated by the flickering lights and the fierce fire in her eyes. She spoke not as a commander demanding obedience, but as a fellow exile sharing a sacred trust. "We fight not because we seek war, but because we seek life," she said, her voice steady and clear. "They called this a death sentence, but we have made it our beginning. No matter what comes, we stand together, not as prisoners, but as the architects of our future." The silence that followed was broken by a surge of determined cheers, a promise echoed in every heart. When the Commonwealth fleet arrived, cold and unyielding against the starry backdrop, it found a colony transformed, fortified by unity, inspired by hope, and armed with the fierce will of those who refused to be forgotten. The battle that ensued was not just a conflict of weapons, but a contest of spirit and resolve. Kayla led from the front, her strategic brilliance and unbreakable courage galvanizing her people. They fought with every tool, every advantage born from intimate knowledge of their home's treacherous terrain and the indomitable strength forged in exile's crucible. And as the dust settled, the Commonwealth's forces withdrew, forced to reckon with a rebellion that was no longer a footnote in history, but a force destined to reshape it. In the aftermath, Nyx 9 became more than a prison, it became a symbol. Kayla's story spread through the galaxy, a testament to the power of resilience and the unyielding flame of hope that can arise even from the coldest darkness. The exiles rebuilt their home, not as victims of sentence, but as pioneers of a new destiny, their voices rising in unison to forge a future where no one would be condemned to oblivion. Kayla stood upon the ridge overlooking the colony, the distant stars no longer cold sentinels, but a tapestry of possibilities woven by those who dared to dream beyond exile's shadow. They called it a death sentence, but for Kayla and her people, it was only the beginning.